To elaborate further on what Isabel just said, patient input is very broad and general. It can include many aspects that is coming from the patients, including patient opinions expressed publicly, including via social media, and other ways of collecting what patients are experiencing. The patient's perspective is more how the patient is expressing its experience with a disease or condition, and how he's coping with this disease or condition. If we go back then to what Isabel just said, patient-reported outcome is complementary to patient preferences. It measures how the patient is feeling with a given treatment. And patient preferences is going one level deeper and is asking, how does patient A make me feel compared to treatment B? How can what is my preference between treatment A and treatment B? So with that, I hand over to Monika, who is presenting the next slides.
Thank you very much, Mireille. And yeah, let's go to the next slide. And the next slide is talking, or is getting us back again to a slide that Isabel showed, where we are in Prefer. So just as a reminder, Prefer is coming to its end. Next year, in 2022, Prefer will be finalized. And actually, now it's important to see how does it help to improve the future? What is the impact for the future? And if we take the picture of a house, we can see that Prefer builds a foundation with providing outcome documents, for example, recommendations on how to do preference studies, what's important. Then there's an operational guide. There are training materials as well as supportive documents. And how can these things help? Well, they should help to increase the number of patient preference studies to be conducted in the life cycle of the medical product decision making. So whenever, in our case, we are talking about the interactions with regulatories, whenever there is an interaction between industry and regulatory, then preference studies may play a role, and the foundation of Prefer will help to do and to provide best practice in conducting the preference studies. With this, we ensure there's good implementation of preference studies, but on a different, on the next step, it also continues to enhance the field of patient preference studies based on what Prefer provided. Going to the next slide, let's talk about how patient preference studies inform the medical product decision making. And as I said, we are talking here about the interactions between industry and regulators. And a main topic to discuss between these two partners is the choice of patient-relevant endpoints. Why is this important? The patient-relevant endpoints will help to inform the clinical trials. And how can patient preference inform these patient-relevant endpoints? Well, patient preference studies help to measure the what and the how much is it important to patients. So with this, it's not only that one informs one product, potentially one informs a whole disease area, because usually you have more products for one disease area, and the patient preference studies support to develop patient-relevant endpoints, which are then relevant to all products which will come up in the future. And then the regulators, they use patient preference to make the decision on the key endpoints when they make a benefit-risk assessment. So patient-relevant endpoints and the benefit-risk trade-off, these are two very key elements for patient preference studies in the clinical development program. And the next slide will show where these patient preference studies will sit. Here on this slide, we display the clinical development program for a new product. So the phase 1 study is when a compound comes first into man. That means here volunteers will be in a clinical trial to get a first information on the safety of the product. Then it goes to the phase 2, where safety and efficacy get studied on small numbers of patients. Phase 3, same questions, but in a far larger number of patients. Then it comes hopefully to an approval for the compound. And the phase 4 is basically everything that happens after it is approved by the FDA and the EMA, as mentioned by Isabel earlier. And then there are also studies to study further the safety of the compound within a broad group of patients. So now let's come to where patient input sits. We saw from Mireille the nice picture about patient input, which is a broad way of getting information, and a patient preference is one piece of that. If you think of phase 1 and 2, there's probably the qualitative information of relevance. Here, the patient input comes through individuals, through literature, social media, and qualitative research like the focused in-depth interviews, as mentioned. They also happened in Prefer. And all these information will be discussed between industry and regulators. There are always touch points to see how to move forward and then to find the most relevant, the key patient-relevant endpoint. And this is then also in phase 2, all the way to the approval, where the industry and regulators talk a lot about what are the key endpoints. There's then the quantitative research that helps to understand the what and the how much it matters. There are treatment effects which get evaluated in the phase 3 clinical trials. And then with having the treatment effects as much as how much it is important for a patient, one can start to do the benefit risk assessment. So to understand what is the acceptability of a certain risk against a certain benefit. And this is what all goes in the documents that will lead to an approval. And when then an approval is given, it's not stopping. The relevant endpoints remain to be critical, and patient preference remain to be important to continue the support of studies in so-called post-authorization safety studies, in benefit risk assessment, in medical product class reviews. So what you can see from this picture throughout the entire life cycle of the clinical development programs and the approval process, patient preference studies can play a very important role to support the decision-making. And with this, I hand over again to Mireille.
Yes, thank you very much, Monika. So what are the main applications for patient preferences in regulatory decision-making? As we saw just from Monika, it's really important that in very early development, we engage with regulators before doing a patient preference study on why we would do so. There are many conditions where the symptoms are either ignored by the healthcare professionals, or the importance of the symptoms is not ranked as high as it should be. Being a patient myself, I had to live with a condition which was completely underreported. It's only once the symptoms were extremely high that it was actually acknowledged. So that's also an important message to share with the regulators. And how this will impact the decision itself. So When we go one step further during marketing authorization, here the choice of endpoints, as we saw for Monika, is quite important to be discussed, and how these will be impacting the outcome of the regulatory decision making, how they contribute to the key benefits of a treatment. So this is really very important. It complements, of course, clinical evidence. There should be always a balance between the two. And then it is important to understand also the benefit-risk trade-offs, and how patients would be ready to accept uncertainty in their treatment. If you have a severe condition, what would you be ready to accept, for example, compared to quality of life? These are important decisions which need to be made aware and need to be raised at the regulatory level. And when to start this dialogue with the regulators, of course, this needs to start very early on at a scientific advice level. And this happens throughout the life cycle of a product, so prior and during marketing authorization, as Monika just showed us, and it doesn't end. We have, thank God, a good post-marketing surveillance in Europe, and there are also mechanisms where patient preferences can be integrated to improve this post-marketing surveillance, and how it can help to shape a better inclusion of patients' voice. The preferred framework is the one element that will help to guide what is the study purpose and how the research question should be framed and discussed. So if we go the next, this is the next slide. And here we will be discussing how the framework is structuring the dialogue on the framework. So first we start with the planning of first the setup of a study, how the study purpose is defined, what will be the study objectives. And then we go to the planning of the study, discussing the details, the logistics of the study setup, and then finally going into the design, and which is giving in a very practical way how to calculate how many patients do we need to have a representative sample size, which method we would be selecting, etc. So these are important elements. And then finally, we do the actual study. We first pilot, and then we recruit the patients. We gather the data from the patients and analyze them. And finally, we have to report the results of this study. And these results need also to be shared in full transparency with the patients. And then finally, applying these patient preferences in informing decision-making.